welcome back overall from last episode. The eBay injectors were a scam, that's what we found out, and so generally, I'll just recommend go buy some new ones or get some used ones from a legitimate person and so on. A lot of places you can get injectors in general, just don't use the eBay reman scam ones. Besides that, this episode overall, we're going to be trying to, basically saying a week later, we had to overnight some parts, go get the injectors from the BMW dealership, and just knock this thing out. And so I didn't really record every little step of it, but you'll see along the way what we did, and I'll explain it as we kind of go. So much like with a whole lot of maintenance jobs in general, first things first, gotta take this intake manifold off. The whole goal of this is to get the valves cleaned in general, and unfortunately I didn't show the actual cleaning process with the the walnut blaster, like a lot of people will end up doing, but there's plenty of videos out there on the internet showing how to do that, and you could basically reference what I was doing with those videos as well. But I want to get those valves cleaned, since obviously this car has 146 some thousand miles on it, and so I don't know when the last time they're done. The valves look pretty good, so I mean, they probably didn't need to be done, but it's better just to start from a fresh template, fresh plate, whatever. You can see me struggling here with the intake manifold. A lot of people don't talk about this with these intake manifolds in this, and they probably don't show because, whenever these jobs are done, I bet someone, leaves these 3 bolts out, but there's 3 little Torx bolts underneath the intake manifold holding on the wiring loom to the bottom side of it, and those things are a pain in the ass. Honestly, I didn't put them back in myself, and I recommend you don't either. Following in right after that, once I got the intake manifold off, and I didn't show taking it off all the way because I just don't have the time, but coming into it, basically I just realigned the valve cover gasket, took the valve cover off, very simple after you get the whole wiring harness and everything above, with injectors, everything out anyway. There's a lot of funky, hoses and whatnot you gotta do. I redid the vacuum lines for the hose wrapping up the front over the front of the valve cover by the timing chain and so on, and I did all that little stuff, which I also don't show, but the biggest thing is, I'm just basically putting out what my goals were with this overall project, and the valve cover was a big one here, and I replaced, or I didn't really replace, but these bolts have these, shims and these locks in there that you have to basically put in, and I lost 1 or 2, so I bought new bolts as well while I was going through it, guys, when I was taking it apart throughout the week. So either way, got some new ones of these. So anyway, when doing the valve cover overall, you're just putting it back in, and these bolts are already pre-aligned, which is really nice when doing this. If you get the OEM valve cover gasket itself, it likes to stick in place, and it's actually really easy to do. You don't need any extra compounds or sealants and whatnot for this. And with those locking or those wedges that are holding those bolts together inside the valve cover, if you're putting new ones in, the threads will actually pull them into place and whatnot. You just got to be careful as you're putting it down, because you don't want to go crooked and end up stripping your bolt, obviously, or snapping it. So take your time with it, make sure it's flush as you're going through. I had them in the back here. I should have moved them to the front, to be honest. It would have been way easier to do. But, you live, you learn as we go through this, and more or less you're just torquing it down. Try to do, crisscross inside-out pattern when you're doing the valve cover to make sure it applies even pressure all the way around. But for the most part, it's basically said and done. After I did this, I basically did the valves, and clean those, and I'll have it all put back together in here in one of these next scenes, because I was just trying to get this done. But the valve situation, man, the camera work and so on, it was just so tight in the shop, and it was really tough to overall organize it all. I just couldn't confidently say I'm just gonna do this. And if you notice here, I got my man bun going on. I got my haircut before I left for the trip to California, and I'm editing post the trip, so you can see me with my haircut that I had after the trip to California. I was growing it out to donate it, so with that I put out a Twitter post quite a while ago and so on on my main coaching stuff. First cylinder, is going to be the cylinder closest to your timing chain, or closest to the cooling fan for anyone trying to do this, and that's 1 going to 6 all the way back in a straight line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6 is by the firewall, 1's by the front, and 2 through 5 fill in like you'd expect. And basically, when putting these in, when you're doing these new injectors, honestly, they should just slide right in. When I was putting these in with the with brand new injectors and the seals all compressed with that metal fitting they put around it, they just slid perfectly in. Then I just went ahead and tightened up the fuel rail lines here, and it basically went really smoothly from here. It wasn't like those knockoff injectors that were just really tight and just didn't really feel right. Anyway, coming into the end of these injectors, went up, putting them all in, getting this all tightened down. I basically did clean those valves right after this, and with all the dust flying around, I want to make sure the injectors are in, so none of the walnuts ended up falling into the cylinders from around the area. I didn't blow any dust into the cylinders, so I made sure I used all of the pressure stuff afterwards. Intake going on was a lot easier than taking off, unless I try to put that wiring loom back on the bottom side of it with those 3 bolts. But at the end of the day, I just didn't want to deal with that, so I just zip tied the wiring loom, up tight against itself with the wires, so it's not really just dangling freely and bouncing around. And then after that, I just put the intake manifold back on and just started relining everything up. I also realized when going through the whole process here on my way in, because I had a boost leak that I was trying to hunt down while I was doing all this, that the boost leak was actually just one vacuum line going from my diverter valves into the bottom side of my intake manifold. And I couldn't see that vacuum line blew off or was disconnected with the stock airbox. So when I realized that that was probably the problem when I was going through all this maintenance, I ordered in some pod filters. That way if I ever have a boost leak in the future, I could just easily identify where it is. I am honestly not someone that goes off and buys pod filters usually, because it's just like the efficiency usually is not any better than a stock air intake, or it's not really, that's not usually not your restriction on like a BMW especially. But when it came down to the visibility of my vacuum lines and seeing where these leaks might be coming from and just general maintenance and ease of use, or ease of taking them off too, the way easier to take off, I was like, you know what, I have to have them. And so when putting everything back together, I basically just made sure I got some pod filters to make it happen, and you'll see those come on here at the end as they're going through. But more or less, putting it all back together, it's really just the same way you took it apart. Make sure you come through and just put all the bolts back together. Make sure your hoses are running properly. There's a lot of O2 sensor lines that come in between the manifold and the valve cover on these engines. It's a really like complex wiring loom section, but I kind of tried to simplify as much as I could by zip tying stuff to the back, of the engine bay to keep it a little more tight and compact, and then run it back through the front. And I more or less took my time with basically each step of it to make sure I didn't forget anything. I watched some videos on YouTube. Honestly, watch some more descriptive videos than what I'm showing you right here. There's so many of them when it comes down to this. Watch them in reverse, go backwards in steps. Even a lot of these guys show you how to put it back together in the way they like to do it. But more or less, that's all that really happened. And really just comes down to torquing down these fuel lines and just getting it back to the way you found it. One comment that might help out, and I'm kind of undoing it right now after I was getting these pod filters back on, but the big power cable that connects to your rear battery and so on, it goes over the top side of the engine. You can't really pull back or forward or around anywhere. But what I found is that there's a nice wiring loom or connector that came off the back side of your stock airbox, and I was able to zip tie it to that, and it held it up so high when doing this project. If you can zip tie that wiring, that power cable up high to where it's floating over everything, that made everything so easy to install and put back together, as well as taking the valve cover on and off. It honestly, just find a way to zip tie that power cable up high and move everything back behind the valve cover, and it's going to be a beautiful overall job. It makes it so much easier in getting the thing removed again. Obviously, when going through this, put your air canisters back in, got to make sure that happens. I recommend putting the the vacuum hoses on the bottom side first, then finishing them in bit by bit, bolting it kind of down a little bit, don't torque it down yet, and then put the vacuum lines back on the top. The bottom ones first, obviously, because it's going to be the hardest ones, and then just work your way from bottom to top. Overall, I replaced all these lines from those hard lines that came through the valve cover gasket and so on. If you're doing a valve cover gasket yourself, honestly, just get the vacuum line, replace it bit by bit, and just make sure it's all fresh, because you're going to be taking apart a lot of this again if your vacuum line just ends up going out, and it's just a nice, it's a comfort of life, man. And at the end of the day, when it came down to it, I have stock inlets and outlets or so on, or stock inlets to my turbos. And when I got done with doing this with the new vacuum lines and everything, I was making on the peak amount of boost in my tune, I was making 23 pounds, 22 pounds. It's a phenomenal boost for stock inlets, honestly. I've never heard of anyone getting that much amount of boost, and I might even be getting a misreading or something. But even then, this car was getting so much just genuine, consistent boost in power. It's worth just making sure it happens. With all said and done now, I'm basically just priming the overall gas with it all put back together, pressing the power overall on and off, and you can see I even tried to start there a second ago. But more or less, a lot of this is just kind of getting it through bit by bit, making sure it even will get close to firing up. So really priming the fuel system is just powering the lights on and off again in the dash, and that basically will just shove fuel to the front. You're not going to get the high pressure fuel pump to pressurize the whole top side of it, but you'll just get enough fuel for it to deliver. And you can see there I was kind of just checking out the engine bay bit by bit, trying to figure out what's going on, because it wasn't really firing yet, and I want to make sure it wasn't leaking or there's anything crazy. And then I basically get it fired up here in just a second, and I just check for anything, and you can see here I just tightened down one of the lines. One of my lines was a little leaky, and it ended up being pretty leaky through and through, so I put some paper towels underneath to make sure I could catch any of the fuel so it doesn't go everywhere. And I tried firing up again, a little bit, checking that fuel and so on. It was a bit better, but really I need to swap these around. So I swapped cylinders 1 and 3 to see if it ended up being the hose or the connector, and I didn't really get a perfect fit out of the gate, but I did get it to where it ended up sealing by swapping the two a little bit after, and that ended up seemed to be fixing my problem. But I do have a bit of a fuel smell, and I have a sneaking suspicion that my fuel smell is coming from one of those that I ended up swapping just being a little leaky. So we'll see how that goes. I'll try and get that diagnosed here soon in a future video, but it's not something on top of my priority list at the moment. And I basically finished off one more test fire to make sure it wasn't leaking between those two. I could see that one of them was just like slightly like bubbling up bit by bit, probably kind of like self-beam to a degree, but I basically just tightened that down a little bit off camera here, and then I just gave it a last fire to double check and sent its maiden voyage out of the shop, and finally took it for a test drive down the street and started driving it back home and whatnot to basically get ready for California. After this overall said and done before California, I did a fresh brake job on it, you know, did new sensors, pads, rotors, and whatnot, because I was going to do some canyons. Wanted to make sure I was 100% prepped to take those roads at the speeds I wanted to take them safely, safely as possible, without a roll cage, obviously, but as safely as possible, and that's more or less the way we ended it. Well, let's get this cover back on. I'll screw it in. Go for a test drive. Check under the car. Make sure I don't run anything over.